to imagine a child born in the first world today. He will never know a world without the internet. He may or may not have been conceived by two people actually having sex. A once outrageous idea that's now so normal that I see ads for IVF clinics on the back of taxis and in train stations. If he's born in Australia, his life expectancy at birth is 82. But each year he lives, it's likely to rise with no known upper limit. He could easily live well beyond 100 and age at a much slower rate than the humans today, which means he could still be living a vital and productive life at an age of 120 or 150. And so, by the way, could many of you. We know he will be online before he can talk. In his childhood and adolescence, PCs and typing on keyboards will seem as parochial to him as rotary phones and, fax machines seem to us. As he grows up, computers won't be things that sit on our desks. They'll be things that are everywhere, in our built environments and inside of us. They'll be monitoring our health, regulating our environments, driving our cars, and augmenting and integrating with our bodily systems and cognitive processes. This kid may not always think of himself as one person. Like everybody here, yes, he'll have a physical, real body and persona, but he'll also have many virtual ones. And these will be far more astoundingly immersive than your Facebook profile or your Twitter account or your Tinder account today. He could be a being of many personalities and many forms and genders. He might experiment with virtual dating and virtual sex before moving on to the real thing. But by then, it's entirely possible that augmented and real reality will be so blended that we won't even be distinguishing between them. They will all just be part of what we know as reality. It's hard to know if in 25 years he'll still have values, ideals, and expectations that are really anything like ours are today. It's hard to know if he'll still think that it's a good idea to have biological children of his own by then, when so much of life could be lived in intermediary states between the real and the virtual worlds. And it's completely impossible to know what he will do with his life, because most of the jobs that will be done by his generation haven't been invented yet. Now, there's a small chunk of this vision that will have most of you, I hope at least, saying, yeah, that's pretty obvious. And that's the stuff to do with computers. We all know that the technology around us that we're used to changes quite rapidly within the space of our lifetimes, and this stuff is observable. We're also reasonably well primed to expect big economic shifts and the decline of traditional forms of labour. And I think Jim Gates definitely alluded to this with self-driving lorries and robots in factories. And really, that's only the beginning. Where we really start to balk at a vision of accelerating technological change is not when we think about changes to our computers and external realities. It's when we start to think about the technology merging with us, merging with who we are and changing how we think about ourselves as human beings. And this is especially confronting when it involves biology to any substantial degree. Because as humans, we've always thought of ourselves as an organic species, whether God-designed or silently and insensibly evolved. We have bodies, we have brains. We're born, we live, we don't live for a very long time, and then we die. And this has been a fundamental part of our human identity for as long as we have existed. Our art reveres and laments it. Our science examines it. Our metaphysics seeks to understand it. It's pretty much the only part of us that hasn't been disrupted in our short but rampant history of remaking ourselves and the world. But In the 21st century, humans are taking on biology as a final frontier, and this will be more disruptive than we can easily imagine. Biology is something that we've tweaked in little ways over time with a lot of guesswork and a lot of trial and error. We've had big aspirations throughout history, but very crude tools. But today is different. Today we're heading into an age of enormous data sets, genomic sequencing and personalized medicine, virtual reality, and wearable and implanted computing, which will be fundamentally revolutionary. We're integrating more and more with the technology that we have created, and we're creating a hybrid, or a transhuman species. Forget the semantics about when we became transhumans. Was it with the first flint axe or with industrialization? Was it with computers or AI or the internet? It doesn't matter. This talk isn't going to be Transhumanist History 101. It's going to be about the transhumanist logic of accelerating change, which ties in profoundly with the big history story of cosmic evolution. And this is precisely because it's the same story. And by the end, we'll get to some of the potential impacts on your life in the immediate future. The key point of this talk is that this merging of man and machine is scaling up dramatically today, which means that you could all see more change in your lifetimes than people once saw in a century or 1,000 or even tens of thousands of years. And for most of us, I think we will also see dramatically more changes in the next phases of our lives than in all of the previous phases combined. Remember that once modern Homo sapiens appeared on the scene, it took more than 80,000 years for us to start transitioning from a hunter-gatherer to an agrarian way of life. But then it only took, say, 15,000 years for us to industrialize, and then only a few hundred for us to make it into the information age. And that means that we should expect the next paradigm, the next shift that involves this merging of humanity and technology to happen even faster, which means we should expect to see it this century. This amping up of the rate of cultural evolution can all be explained by what the entrepreneur, futurist, and engineer Ray Kurzweil calls the law of accelerating returns. The law says that evolutionary systems generate positive feedback mechanisms, so that each successive phase of evolution can generate more order, which often, but not always in Kurzweil's definition, equals complexity, and that this keeps happening at faster and faster rates. As I said, this is the big history story, but using epochs instead of thresholds, and honing in more precisely on information and technology in the evolutionary sequence, which I think is a compelling way of framing it. So if we go back to the beginning of the universe, we get information encoded in atomic structures. After billions and billions of years, with biology, we start to see information encoded in RNA and DNA. With brains, we get a new threshold of complexity, and information is transmitted through neural pathways. Then human brains develop technology. Eventually, we write stuff down, we print it, and we start to encode it in hardware and software. And this process allows a massive amping up of the data and knowledge that we transmit, share, retain, and build on. And this brings us to the point that we're seeing now, which is Epoch 5, this merger of humanity and technology. The next something new that forms part of this broader evolutionary continuum. Whether we ever get to anything like Epoch 6 is anyone's guess. There are too many contingencies and potential setbacks in play in Epoch 5 for now. But I do think that Epoch 6, a spreading out of intelligence across the universe, is about as good as many other long-term predictions about humanity. And from a human perspective, it's a little bit more rousing and dynamic because it at least involves the continuation of intelligence, which we definitely don't see in the model of entropy. So at this point, I really want to explain how this evolutionary trajectory that's led to accelerating change on Earth is exponential, which means it differs massively from the linear rate of change that our brains like to expect. This is well and truly been a conference of hockey sticks, and we've heard the term bandied about in almost every single presentation. I actually collected a few from Jan's talk, and these are just a small sampling of all these kinds of explosive graphs that we've seen in both positive and negative ways talking about acceleration throughout the Anthropocene. And I think this basic concept of exponential growth can be really useful here in terms of thinking about cosmic evolutionary history and extrapolating into the future of this particularly novel acceleration phase that we're living through today. So linear versus exponential, to take it back to how we process the world, our brains are programmed to think in a linear way. They've evolved, as we've heard again many times, to survive on the African savanna, in which frames of reference and social groups were very small, very localized. We knew maybe 100 or so people in the course of our lives. And not much changed for thousands of generations. We spent our days thinking about the immediate future, what we're going to eat, the predators in our environment, where we're going to sleep, and surely the perennial question of who with. And even though our world today is global, dynamic, and non-linear, our minds default to these small timescales and personal frames of reference. And we keep expecting slow change. So to break it down, a linear rate of change doesn't compound or increase over time. If you count ahead 10 linear steps, it's very basic. You would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? On the graph, it's going to look something like the red line. But exponential growth is very different to this. Exponential change does compound, and it grows at a constant rate. So you would count 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and after 10 steps, you would be at 512. Very basic. But you can already see a massive difference between 10 steps getting us to 10 and 10 steps getting us to 512. The trick is that depending on what we're talking about, 512 is not a very big number. And so we have to remember that in the early stages of an exponential sequence, yeah, we're compounding, yeah, we're doubling at the same interval, but we're often doubling really tiny numbers or percentages. And so you don't see this arc of runaway change. And that's why early on you can see that the yellow line looks pretty similar to the red for quite a substantial amount of time. It's once that exponential growth has taken enough steps to start dealing with massive numbers that the doublings get really profound and the change starts to seem runaway. Instead of seeming like this slightly bending upwards curve, it takes off in this full explosion of growth. To switch over to a more familiar example, we can see the major paradigm shift in cultural evolution transitioning from an agrarian to an industrial way of life. The point here is that you would never predict the crazy spike of industrialization, even if you were on the precipice about to experience it. To your mind, the world would look like this. But out of nowhere, we see a new paradigm take off at an overwhelming pace, and things really end up looking something like this. To really reinforce how that change can come out of nowhere, imagine you're filling up a glass of water, and you fill it with more water at an exponential rate every minute. At 1 minute, there's a tiny droplet of water. The glass is practically empty. And at 60 minutes, it's completely full. But at 59 minutes, the glass is only half full. At 58 minutes, it's 25% full. At 57 minutes, it's 12.5% full. At 56 minutes, it's only 6% full. And at 55 minutes, the glass is only 3% full. So most of the way into this journey, you're going to be sitting there thinking, this is crazy, this is ridiculous, I'm going to be here forever. The glass will never fill up in time. And yet we see that in the last 5 minutes, this takes off in this explosion where the numbers double at high enough levels to fill that glass in the blink of an eye. And in terms of information technology and cultural evolution, that's really the age we're in now. An age where our minds think they can keep projecting on the basis of those smaller numbers, where change is slow and looks linear, when really we're skirting around that period of the last 5 minutes of this new paradigm of the information age. If we extend that glass example for a minute, imagine that 10 minutes later you keep filling it up at the same rate, and you'd have filled an entire bathtub. If you kept going for another hour, you'd have filled the entire Pacific Ocean. So the challenge for our minds is to stop expecting that the line will stay like this, and to get comfortable with the notion that it's quite possible that it will do something more like this in our lifetimes. Now, I can already see at least one objection bubbling away around the concept of S-curves, which is really the idea that in any evolutionary paradigm, we do see that exponential trajectory of things being quite flat for a very long time before they take off and they surge upwards. But the next part of the story is, of course, that they start to plateau and that they flatten out, because there is some kind of physical or environmental limit on that growth. And so a single S-curve would totally look like this by definition. And with that limitation, we can transpose that to the idea of the tail end of the industrial era, where we are seeing limits to growth within this paradigm. But off the bat of the growth that was created in that upward surge of industrialization, greater potential for new forms of complexity was generated. And so in the plateau phase, we have the beginnings of the early stages of the next S-curve, the next paradigm that will build on the one that came before. Which is why the whole of human history doesn't look like something took off and flattened out. It actually looks something like this, with S-curves all up along a broader exponential trajectory that to date has not stopped on its path of increasing complexity. Now, if we think about the limits of growth at this plateau phase of the industrial era, it's obvious we can't keep burning fossil fuels. We can't sustain current farming practices and keep feeding a growing population. But I think it's apparent, at least for now, that we're building on the complexity that industrialization generated, and that we're on the slow part of the next S-curve of the information age, where we think, okay, there's all this new technology, there's all these potential innovations, there's this rampant capacity for collective learning, but they're not moving fast enough or scaling up at the rate that we need. And that may be true, but maybe it isn't. Maybe we're 55 minutes in and the glass is only 3% full. But what if in a minute or so, the wellspring of innovation fills up and starts to overflow? Maybe Ray Kurzweil's right, and we could make a full transition to solar energy by 2030. He argued last year that as solar comprised 1% of the global energy supply, that we were halfway to 100, because it took 7 doublings to get to 1%, and after 7 more doublings at 2-year intervals, we'd be over the 100 mark. And I know, the logic seems childishly simple, bordering on the ridiculous. But in 2015, we're already over the 1% threshold, which does technically put the trajectory on track. And yes, that ultimately proves nothing. But Kurzweil has used this exact logic before and been right, many times. He used it to predict the takeoff of the internet in terms of users and functions before most people had heard of it. He predicted the year that the Berlin Wall would fall and the Cold War would end. He predicted the year that a computer for the first time would beat the world chess champion. And Bill Gates has called him the best person I know at predicting trends in artificial intelligence. The other famous example is, of course, the Human Genome Project. 7 years into the project, only 1% of the genome had been sequenced. And critics thought this was preposterous. They said it would take nearly a century to finish it, it would cost billions of dollars, it was basically a fool's errand. And Kurzweil said, no, it's progressing exponentially, and so it's basically exactly on track. And bam, 6 years later, the project was completed ahead of schedule, and since then we've seen a massive scaling down of the costs of being able to sequence a genome from about, I think, $100 million to somewhere around the $1,000 mark today. And yeah, because he's been right before, it doesn't mean he'll be right this time. I think Elon Musk puts the date for a transition to solar closer to 2050, and both could be wrong. Though I like the idea that with private investment, it could actually turn out to be something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, even if they are right, relying on this outcome and assuming that everything else will be completely fine would be as lazy and as ineffectual as explaining this method of how the universe came into being. There is more to the story of the Anthropocene than one technology, one prediction, one curve. But this stuff is worth thinking about, precisely because it's so counterintuitive and so potentially game-changing and disruptive. And even if it doesn't happen, it at least makes sense that it could. And the knock-on effects if it did would be so profound. So I know I'm a fair way in here, and I haven't yet talked about the singularity or runaway superintelligence or brain uploading or swarms of nanobots. Sorry. And that's not because I think it's all science fiction gobbledygook. Quite the opposite. I think these are all big issues that we should all take seriously. The problem is, none of those ideas would make any sense without the law of accelerating returns. Most of you would tell me that it would have to take centuries for machines to reach and surpass human intelligence, or for self-assembling nanobots to be viable, or to be a part of our biological makeup. And this is because those linear brains of ours only know how to think that change will happen today at the same rate as it happened in the 20th century, when already we know it's happening much faster. And again, I know Jim Gates brought up synthetic biology, nanotech, and AI in his list of existential risks, which gives you some clue that this stuff is being taken seriously by governments around the world, and not just by techno-dystopians in some far-off corner of the internet. If you're interested in learning more about those kinds of existential risks, you could not do better than to read Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, which is a very measured look at the issue, and it doesn't spruik doomsday. It promotes the issue as underfunded and under-researched, and seeks to understand if it will actually be possible to mitigate these risks and to conduct tangible research into the pathways in which artificial intelligence might evolve. And of course, these three humans, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Stephen Hawking, have notably identified AI as a serious risk for humanity in the future. In terms of long-term evolutionary prospects, Ted Chu's book, Human Purpose and Transhuman Potential, argues that humanity's best bet is to co-evolve with machines, because remaining human is in itself an existential risk, which is kind of a novel idea. We've got these ancient brains, when we're terribly prone, as I think David Baker reminded us, to killing each other and warring over very, very stupid things. We're not good at long-term decision-making. And hey, what about supervolcanoes, super earthquakes, solar flares, and non-anthropogenic climate change? Being human in some ways is like being a sitting duck. So while merging with machines and becoming post-human could be dangerous, he thinks it might actually be our best shot. At least in the short term, more intelligence and less emotional tribalism could help us tackle many immediate problems in terms of poverty, climate change, war, and so on. And in the long term, I think it could give the concept of the good life a whole new meaning as we explore the universe and grow and learn and experience things that to us right now are as unfathomable as our lives are to a cockroach or a prokaryote. Now the clock is ticking and I'm going to start winding up with a few things that I think are really cool about living in this age of accelerating technological change. Really basically, we have more access via our smartphones to more intelligent knowledge than the President of the United States 20 years ago. When I was in school, I had to go to a library to get books that were usually a few decades old if I actually wanted to know or fact-check something. Every single one of us can now log on to Coursera and learn big history, or use the Khan Academy or Udacity to learn anything else we fancy at any stages of our lives, and keep building on this knowledge as lifelong learners, most of it being free. Today, over 3 billion humans are online. In 10 years, there will be another 3 billion, and soon the entire world will be connected, which is fantastic because it means more sharing of knowledge, insight, empathy, and creativity, a larger and better global brain, better tools to ameliorate the worst effects of poverty, and of course, exponential improvements in the price performance of information technologies means that poorer countries will be able to adopt revolutionary new technologies not long after the First World. This is an age of revolutions in medical technology and healthcare. In a decade or so, most of you will have had your genome sequenced. And the more people that do, the more usable knowledge that we will have that we can actually aggregate and act on in a clinical setting to cure disease, sharpen the mind, and slow the aging process. More exciting is this collection of data, and I did actually miss Michael's talk, but I think you mentioned Craig Venter and possibly the Human Longevity Inc., where they're collecting data from the genome, the microbiome, and the phenotype, and they're concocting this epigenetic picture of how the three interact. I'm actually having my microbiome sequenced right now, and of course that information won't be diagnostically useful yet, but it will contribute to building the data set, which is yet another thing that is going to look like a hockey stick. A few years of gradual growth and then an explosion of data as we get into the millions and the billions of humans having these kinds of procedures done. This is set to be an age of virtual reality and robot friends and lovers, which I see not as an age of losing our humanity, but of expanding our choices. An age where we can be who we want to be in virtual worlds and experience things that are beyond our real world means. I was going to tell you about the time I had virtual sex using the Oculus Rift, but I'm really running out of time and that bit's going to have to go. But you guys absolutely must watch this documentary, The Digital Love Industry, which is surprising, empathetic in many ways, and will kind of blow your minds in terms of what's coming literally in the next few years in that respect. To wrap up, I want to say I don't want to dismiss any of the immense challenges of the Anthropocene here. But I also think there's room to see this as an era of astounding promise for humanity, to live longer, healthier, and more fulfilling lives with more education and more choice than any human who has ever lived before. A future that stands to be possible, not just for those in this room or for those in the first world, but for everyone around the world. Exponential growth is not a crystal ball, and transhumanism is not the be-all and end-all of the Anthropocene, or of thinking about the future of humanity. But I think there are a lot of transhumanist-type technologies and scenarios that could add value to Threshold 9-type thinking in big history. And I think that a flexible mind that at least has this story among many, that embraces cosmic evolutionary history and that is comfortable with many possible future outcomes and evolutionary trajectories, will fare better in this age of upheaval than a mind with one hope, one story, or one ideal. Thank you.